They thought it was just another quiet house to rob. No alarms, no signs of trouble. Until the doors locked behind them, a voice echoed through the walls, and a shadow emerged with a trained dog by her side. What they didn't know? They had just broken into the home of a police chief. The events that followed changed everything. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the suburban neighborhood seem frozen in time. A sleek black SUV moved slowly down the street, its headlights dimmed to avoid drawing attention. Inside the vehicle, 3 men sat, their faces partially hidden under masks. The leader, Marcus, leaned forward in his seat, scanning the rows of houses as if picking a prize from a lineup. His voice was low but confident as he pointed to a large 2-story house at the end of the block. "That's the one," he said, smirking. "No cameras, no lights, and probably no alarms. Easy pickings." Eli, the driver, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I don't know, man, this feels off," he muttered, glancing at the dark house. His stomach churned, but he kept his voice steady, not wanting to seem weak. Marcus shot him a glare. "Don't start now. We've gone over this. In and out in 5 minutes. What's there to worry about?" Jake, the youngest of the group, sat quietly in the back seat, fiddling nervously with the strap of his backpack. It was his first job, and he was desperate to prove himself, but the pit in his stomach grew with every second. "What if someone's home?" he finally asked, his voice shaky. Marcus chuckled darkly. "Then we scare them a little. No big deal. Trust me, they won't be a problem." The SUV slowed to a stop a few houses down from their target. Marcus handed Jake a crowbar and opened his door, motioning for them to follow. Eli hesitated for a moment, but the weight of Marcus's stare left him no choice. Together they crept through the shadows, staying low as they approached the house. The front yard was neat and unassuming, with a single porch light that flickered faintly. It looked like any other house on the street, ordinary and quiet. Jake hesitated at the front door, his fingers trembling as he slid the crowbar into the doorframe. Marcus stood beside him, his voice a harsh whisper. "Hurry up. Don't overthink it." With a sharp crack, the door gave way, and the men slipped inside, careful not to make a sound. The house was dark, the air cool and still. It smelled faintly of coffee and lavender, a strange detail that Jake noticed in his nervous state. Eli closed the door softly behind them, his heart pounding as he scanned the hallway. "See? Easy," Marcus whispered, his tone laced with smug satisfaction. He gestured toward the staircase. "Check upstairs. I'll handle down here." Jake swallowed hard and nodded, heading toward the stairs while Eli stayed frozen near the door, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Something about the house felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating, as though the walls themselves were watching them. As Marcus rifled through a drawer in the living room, he froze for a moment. On the mantel above the fireplace was a row of framed photos. He picked one up, narrowing his eyes at the image of a woman in a crisp uniform. The words, "Chief Rachel Harper," were etched into a brass plate beneath the frame. Marcus's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He put the photo back quickly, shaking his head to dismiss the thought. "Just a retired cop," he muttered under his breath, though his confidence wasn't as firm as it had been. Upstairs, Jake pushed open a bedroom door, his breath catching as he stepped into the darkened room. The faint glow of moonlight through the curtains revealed a large bed and neatly arranged furniture. It seemed untouched, like the room of someone who valued order and discipline. On the nightstand, a badge gleamed faintly in the low light. Jake froze, his blood running cold as he realized what it meant. Before he could react, a faint beep echoed through the house. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of fear through all 3 men. Eli's breath hitched as he looked around, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Probably nothing." "Let's move faster," he said, though his own pulse quickened. But Jake knew better. He stood rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the badge as dread filled him. This wasn't just any house. They weren't just any occupants. Something was very wrong, and they were about to find out just how wrong they had been. The faint beep came again, sharper this time. And it wasn't alone. A low mechanical hum echoed through the house as something shifted. Marcus, crouched near a cabinet, whipped his head around. "What the hell is that?" he hissed, his voice finally betraying a crack in his confidence. Eli's eyes darted toward the walls, his chest tightening. "I told you this was a bad idea," he said, backing toward the front door. His hand reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, panic setting in. "It's locked. The damn door's locked." Jake hurried down the stairs, his face pale and his voice trembling. "Guys, this isn't just anyone's house. There's a badge upstairs, a police chief's badge." His words came out in a rush, his fear overriding any attempt to keep calm. Marcus's jaw tightened as he shot Jake a glare. "Shut up, you don't know what you saw." But his bravado was faltering, and they all felt it. The mechanical hum grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal bolts sliding into place. "Is this a joke?" Marcus muttered under his breath, his hands clenching into fists. He moved toward the door and shoved Eli aside. "Let me handle it." But no matter how hard he pushed or pulled, the door wouldn't give. He turned to the group, his voice rising. "It's just a security system. Stay calm." Jake's voice wavered. "This isn't normal. People don't have lockdown systems like this, not unless they're expecting trouble." A voice crackled to life, coming from hidden speakers in the walls. It was calm, measured, and chilling. "You've got two choices," it said, cutting through the rising tension. "Surrender now, or face the consequences." Eli stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. "Oh my God, they know we're here," he whispered harshly. Marcus gritted his teeth and scanned the room, his eyes landing on a back hallway. "We're not sticking around to find out what consequences mean. We find another way out." He grabbed Jake by the shoulder and shoved him forward. "Move." The three of them made their way down the hall, their footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors. Every creak of the board seemed deafening in the silence that followed the voice. They passed a utility room, then a study, but every window and door they checked was locked tight. It was as though the house had turned into a fortress. Then came another sound, a low growl, deep and menacing. It was faint at first, but grew louder with each step they took. Jake froze, his blood turning to ice. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Eli's breathing quickened as the growl became unmistakable. "It's a dog. There's a dog in here." His voice was shaky, his fear mounting by the second. Marcus waved them forward, though his own steps faltered. "It's just trying to scare us. Keep moving." They turned a corner into a large dining room, the moonlight casting long shadows across the table and chairs. The growl stopped, replaced by the sound of claws clicking on the floor. Jake turned his head, and his heart nearly stopped. At the far end of the room, silhouetted in the doorway, was a massive dog. Its eyes gleamed in the low light, and its stance was unmistakably aggressive. "Marcus," Jake whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The dog took a slow step forward, its growl returning, low and guttural. Marcus took a step back, his confidence now entirely gone. "Stay still," he muttered, though his own legs trembled. Eli, unable to hold his fear any longer, turned and bolted for the hallway. But before he could take more than a few steps, the dog barked, a sharp, commanding sound that froze him in place. The three men were now cornered, trapped between the locked house and the terrifying animal that stood in their path. "This is bad," Jake said, his voice shaking as the dog stepped closer, its teeth bared. The growling filled the room, low and steady, reverberating in the silence. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the dog and back to the nearest window, calculating whether he could make a break for it. Jake, standing motionless, whispered, "What do we do? What do we do now?" The dog advanced another step, its muscles rippling beneath its sleek coat. Its eyes were locked on Marcus, sensing him as the biggest threat. Marcus raised his hand slightly, trying to steady his voice. Easy, boy. We don't want trouble. We're leaving. But leaving wasn't an option anymore, and deep down they all knew it. The voice from the speakers returned, calm but cold, filling the room like an invisible presence. You've already made trouble. Now you'll answer for it. Eli, still frozen by the door, stammered, Who are you? What do you want from us? There was no immediate reply, just the sound of the dog's heavy breathing and the faint hum of the house's security system. Then, after a pause, the voice came again. You broke into my home. You put yourselves in this situation. Now you'll deal with the consequences. Jake, unable to take the tension anymore, turned toward Marcus, his voice rising in panic. We need to get out of here. This isn't worth it. Forget the money. Marcus glared at him, though his own nerves were unraveling. Shut up and stay calm, he hissed. We're not going to be scared off by a dog and some voice on a speaker. Before Jake could respond, the dog barked again, louder this time, its stance shifting forward like it was ready to attack. Jake flinched and stumbled backward, knocking into a chair which toppled over with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the house and the dog responded immediately, lunging forward with a sharp, ferocious snarl. Marcus grabbed a chair and swung it in front of him, the wooden legs trembling in his grip. Stay back, he yelled, though his voice cracked. The dog stopped just short of him, teeth bared, growling louder than before. Its presence was overpowering, its sheer size and ferocity rendering Marcus's defiance almost laughable. Eli, trembling by the door, whispered, We should have never come here. I told you this was a bad idea. His voice was almost inaudible, but Marcus whipped his head around and shouted, Not now! Help me! But Eli didn't move, and Jake looked too terrified to do anything but stay frozen. The tension in the room was suffocating, the three men trapped like animals themselves. The dog, unrelenting, stayed fixed on Marcus, its growls vibrating through the air. And then the voice returned, quieter but sharper, each word cutting through the fear like a blade. You think you can intimidate, take what isn't yours, and walk away without consequences? You broke into the wrong house. This is my territory, and I don't show mercy. Marcus, sweating and breathing hard, snapped, Then show yourself. Stop hiding behind your dog and come out here. The voice paused for a moment before replying, its tone colder than ever. You don't give orders here. I do. And you're not leaving until I decide you can. As the last word echoed, the dog barked once more, its command undeniable, forcing Marcus to take another step back. The three men exchanged nervous glances, their confidence shattered as the realization sank in. This wasn't a house they could escape from. It was a trap, and they were the prey. The air in the room felt thick, every second stretching into an eternity. Marcus's hand tightened around the chair he held like a shield, but it was clear to everyone, even him, that he was no longer in control. The dog stood firm, its growl never ceasing, its teeth gleaming in the faint light filtering through the windows. Eli's voice wavered, breaking the tense silence. Marcus, we've got to give up, man. This is crazy. We're not getting out of here. Marcus turned to him, his face flushed with anger and fear. Shut up. We don't give up. There's always a way out. Jake, his back pressed against the dining room wall, finally found his voice. You don't get it, Marcus. This isn't just some random house. This person knows what they're doing. They've got us locked in here like rats. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, each one sending a jolt of dread through the intruders. The footsteps stopped just before reaching the dining room, and a shadow appeared on the wall, tall, commanding, unmistakably confident. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't through the speakers. It was real, right there in the room. You should have thought twice before stepping through my door. The tone was calm, but every word carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. From the hallway stepped Rachel Harper, her silhouette sharp against the dim light. She held a flashlight in one hand, its beam pointed low, casting an unsettling glow over the room. In her other hand was a small but clearly visible firearm, held steady and pointed downward for now, though its presence was enough to make all three men freeze. Marcus, gripping the chair tightly, managed to sputter. "You think that's gonna scare us? You're just one person." Rachel's lips curved into a faint, cold smile. One person is all it takes when that person knows what they're doing. She nodded toward the dog, who didn't move but continued to growl, its sharp eyes flicking between the three men. "Max here doesn't bluff, and neither do I." Eli, trembling, raised his hands. "We didn't mean anything by it. We just thought—" Rachel cut him off, her voice sharp. "You just thought this house was an easy target. You thought whoever lived here wouldn't fight back. You thought wrong." Jake's knees buckled slightly, and he slid down against the wall, his voice small. "We'll leave. We'll go, I swear. Just let us out." Rachel stepped further into the room, her calm demeanor never faltering. "Let you out? After you broke into my home? After you threatened me, my property, and my dog?" She shook her head slowly. "You made your choices. Now you deal with the consequences." Marcus, still trying to salvage control, pointed the chair toward her like a weapon. "You're not gonna shoot us. That's not how this works." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You're right. I don't have to, but Max doesn't have the same rules." She gave a subtle gesture, and Max took another step forward, his growl deepening. Eli let out a small, panicked sound and dropped to his knees, his hands clasped behind his head. I'm done, don't let the dog near me." Rachel's gaze didn't waver. "Smart choice," she said flatly. Then her eyes shifted to Marcus, her tone colder now. "What about you? Still think you're in charge?" Marcus's bravado finally cracked, his chest heaving as he glared at her. He lowered the chair slightly, but he didn't speak. Jake, still huddled against the wall, whispered, "Marcus, just stop. We're done." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the house's security system and Max's steady growl. Rachel waited, her steady presence filling the room, as the intruders finally realized there was no way out but surrender. Marcus's grip on the chair slackened, and it clattered to the floor with a hollow thud. The sound seemed to echo endlessly, marking the final collapse of his defiance. He raised his hands slowly, his jaw clenched in frustration. "Fine. We'll leave. Just call off the dog," he muttered, his voice laced with reluctant defeat. Rachel didn't move, her flashlight still casting its faint glow across the room. Max stood firm, his growl unwavering, as if daring any of them to make a sudden move. Rachel's gaze swept over the three men, her calm demeanor unshaken. "You're not going anywhere until the police get here." Eli's eyes widened in panic. "The police?" he stammered. No, please. We didn't hurt anyone. We'll just go and never come back." Jake's face paled even more, his head shaking as he pressed his back tighter against the wall. "She's bluffing. She hasn't called anyone yet," he said weakly, as if trying to convince himself. Rachel raised an eyebrow at his words. "Bluffing." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up with a single tap. A notification glowed at the top. "Emergency alert. Security breach reported. Police en route." She held it up for them to see, her voice steady. "They've been on their way since the moment you stepped inside." Eli let out a defeated groan, collapsing onto the floor with his head in his hands. "We're screwed. We're completely screwed." Marcus glared at Rachel, his anger bubbling over into desperation. "You think you've won? You think this is going to end well for you? You don't know who you're messing with." Rachel's expression didn't change, her eyes meeting his with unflinching certainty. "And you don't know whose house you broke into," she replied evenly. "But you're starting to figure it out, aren't you?" Max took a single step forward, his teeth bared, and Marcus instinctively flinched, his earlier bluster now replaced with visible fear. "Call him off," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, her calm, steady presence overwhelming the room. Finally, she gave a short command. "Max, stay." The dog obeyed but remained alert, his sharp eyes fixed on Marcus. Rachel took a slow step closer to the group, her flashlight lowering slightly. "You've been running the show up until now, Marcus. Tell me, how does it feel to lose control?" Marcus glared at her, but his defiance had lost its edge. Jake, trembling against the wall, spoke in a broken voice. "It was his idea. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Rachel turned her sharp gaze to him, her voice firm. "You still chose to come here. You still walked through that door, knowing exactly what you were doing." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The reality of his situation seemed to crash over him all at once, and he slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. In the distance, faint but growing louder, the wail of sirens echoed through the neighborhood. Rachel tilted her head slightly, listening. "Looks like your time's up," she said, her tone even. Eli scrambled forward on his knees, his hands clasped together as if begging. "Please, just let us go. I'll do anything. I swear I won't even tell anyone about this." Rachel's gaze hardened, and her voice turned colder. "You made your choices when you broke into my home. Now you'll deal with the consequences." The flashing red and blue lights outside illuminated the windows, and the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Max barked once, sharp and commanding, as the men's panic reached its peak. "This is it," Rachel said quietly, stepping back as the door behind her unlocked with a faint click. "Let's see if you're brave enough to face the law." The front door swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped into the house, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. One of them, a tall man with a firm but calm demeanor, immediately took in the scene. Three disheveled men, hands raised or pressed against walls, and a massive dog standing guard, its eyes fixed on the intruders. "Chief Harper," the officer addressed Rachel with a nod of acknowledgement. "Everyone safe here?" Rachel lowered her flashlight but kept her eyes on the men. "We're fine, Officer Daniels. These three thought they'd have an easy night breaking into the wrong house." Daniels stepped forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the intruders. "Hands where I can see them. Stay on the ground unless told otherwise." Eli obeyed immediately, his hands shaking as he sprawled onto the floor. Jake followed, his movements slow and hesitant, his gaze darting nervously between Rachel and the officers. Marcus, however, remained standing, his fists clenched and his eyes burning with anger. Daniels narrowed his eyes at Marcus. "You want to make this harder on yourself? Get down. Now." Marcus hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his options. But the sound of Max's growl, low and menacing, brought him back to reality. With a frustrated grunt, he dropped to his knees, raising his hands reluctantly. The second officer, a younger woman, stepped in and began cuffing Eli and Jake, her movements quick and efficient. "You're all under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted theft and criminal trespass," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." As the cuffs clicked into place, Marcus glared up at Rachel. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. "Oh, it's over for you, Marcus. The only thing left is how much time you'll spend regretting it." Daniels cuffed Marcus himself, keeping a firm grip on his arm as he hauled him to his feet. "Let's go," Daniels said, his tone sharp. Marcus didn't resist, but his jaw tightened as he was led toward the door. Jake looked up at Rachel, his face pale and his voice shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his eyes brimming with regret. "I didn't want this to happen." Rachel's gaze softened for a moment, but her voice remained firm. "Then you shouldn't have been here. Apologies don't erase choices." As the men were led outside, the flashing lights illuminated the quiet street. Curious neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and cracked doors, their murmurs faint but unmistakable. Eli looked around, his face crumpling in humiliation. Jake kept his head down, avoiding every gaze. Marcus, however, turned his head back toward Rachel, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and fear. Rachel stood in the doorway, Max at her side, his stance as steady and alert as ever. She watched silently as the officers loaded the men into the back of their patrol cars. Officer Daniels approached her, his notebook in hand. "We'll process them tonight and let you know when the formal charges are filed," he said. Rachel nodded. "Make sure their statements are thorough. I want every word documented." Understood, Daniels replied. He glanced at Max, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He still as sharp as ever? Rachel crouched to pat Max's head, her voice quiet but filled with pride. Sharper. Daniels chuckled softly. Good to see. Let us know if you need anything else. As the officers drove off, taking the intruders with them, Rachel closed the door and locked it. The house, now quiet again, felt heavier somehow, as though the events of the night had left an imprint. She leaned against the door for a moment, exhaling slowly, then looked down at Max. Good job, boy, she murmured, stroking his fur. Max wagged his tail, his watchful eyes still scanning the room as though ensuring the threat was truly gone. Rachel straightened, her resolve returning. The night wasn't over yet. There were reports to file and statements to prepare, but for now the danger had passed, and justice was already in motion. The house was quiet again, but Rachel's mind was anything but. After locking the door and securing the windows, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the side of the mug. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws but his ears twitching at every faint sound. The events of the night replayed in her mind, not with fear, but with a sense of calculated precision. She thought about each of the intruders, their words, their reactions, the choices they had made. Marcus's defiance, Jake's regret, Eli's panic. It was a blend of arrogance and desperation that she'd seen too many times in her career, though it never failed to unnerve her how quickly people underestimated the consequences of their actions. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. Picking it up, she saw Daniel's name on the screen. She answered, her voice calm. Daniels, everything squared away? Mostly, Daniels replied, his tone steady. We've booked them and started processing their statements. Marcus is sticking to his tough guy routine, but the other two? They're cracking. Rachel raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her expression. What are they saying? Eli's blaming Marcus for everything, saying he never wanted to do this, that he was forced into it, Daniels explained. Jake's story is similar, but he's more conflicted. Keeps saying he didn't want to hurt anyone. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling. And Marcus? What's his angle? Daniels let out a short laugh. Claims you set them up. Says it's entrapment. Rachel smirked faintly. Of course he does. Let him spin whatever story he wants. The evidence speaks for itself. There was a pause on the line before Daniels spoke again. You know, Chief, it's not every day someone breaks into a house like yours. The whole precinct's talking about it. Rachel's tone grew firm, though not unkind. Let them talk, just make sure the paperwork is airtight. I don't want any loose ends. You got it, Daniels replied. I'll call you if anything changes. As the call ended, Rachel placed the phone back on the table and sipped her coffee, her thoughts drifting to Jake. His face had lingered in her mind, not because he was a threat, but because of the look in his eyes. It wasn't just fear. There was something else, a flicker of regret, maybe even shame. She'd seen it before in people who still had a chance to change. Max let out a low huff, lifting his head to look at her. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, her voice soft. What do you think, Max? Was he just scared, or does he deserve another chance? The dog wagged his tail slightly, his steady gaze meeting hers as if he understood. Rachel sighed and leaned back in her chair. Doesn't matter. That's up to the courts now. The coffee grew cold as the hours passed and the neighborhood settled into the early hours of the morning. Rachel finally rose from her seat, the weight of the night beginning to lift as the promise of a new day loomed on the horizon. The house was secure, Max was at her side, and the intruders were in custody. But she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Tomorrow there would be reports, court dates, and more questions to answer. Rachel welcomed it. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of peace, running her hand along Max's sturdy frame. Let's get some rest, she said, her voice steady but tired. Together, they moved toward the staircase, the quiet hum of the house enveloping them as they prepared to leave the night behind. The morning sun poured through the windows, casting a warm glow across the quiet house. Rachel stood at the counter, pouring herself another cup of coffee as Max watched her from his usual spot by the couch. The events of the night had left their mark, but the morning brought a renewed clarity. There was work to be done, and Rachel's mind was already organizing the next steps. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a number she recognized. The precinct's detective division. She answered with a quick, "Harper." The voice on the other end was familiar. Detective Logan, a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Morning, Chief. Thought you'd want to know we got something interesting out of Jake last night." Rachel straightened, her focus sharpening. "Go on." He admitted that Marcus planned the whole thing, but here's the twist. Marcus knew exactly whose house it was. Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "He knew? He targeted me?" "That's what Jake says," Logan confirmed. "Marcus figured breaking into the house of a police chief would make for a bigger score. Thought you might have valuables or even cash stashed away. According to Jake, Marcus called it ironic payback." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "And the others? Did they know?" "Eli and Jake claim they didn't. Said Marcus sold it as just another job. No mention of who you were." Logan paused before adding, "Jake seemed genuinely shaken. He keeps talking about how it wasn't supposed to be like this." Rachel glanced at Max, who had perked up, sensing the change in her mood. "Keep digging," she said firmly. "If Marcus targeted me deliberately, I want everything documented. I don't want him wiggling out of this." "Understood, Chief," Logan replied. "I'll keep you updated." As the call ended, Rachel leaned against the counter, her mind racing. Marcus's arrogance wasn't surprising. She'd seen plenty of criminals like him before, people who underestimated the strength of those they targeted. But this felt different. It wasn't just about the crime. It was personal. Max let out a soft bark, drawing her attention. She smiled faintly and knelt beside him, running her hand along his fur. "He thought he'd get away with it, didn't he, Max? Thought we wouldn't fight back." The dog wagged his tail, his steady gaze meeting hers. It was a small comfort, but it reminded her of the strength she'd drawn on the night before. Marcus had made his choices, and now he would face the full weight of the consequences. Later that morning, Rachel headed to the precinct to finalize her statement. The station was bustling, officers moving briskly through the halls with files and radios in hand. When she entered, a few colleagues nodded in acknowledgement, their expressions a mixture of respect and curiosity. Detective Logan met her at the entrance to the interview room, holding a file thick with reports. "We've got everything lined up. Statements from you, the neighbors, and the suspects. Plus the footage from your security system, it's airtight." Rachel nodded, scanning the file briefly. "Good. Let's make sure it stays that way." Logan hesitated for a moment. "One more thing, Chief. Jake asked to speak with you. He's different from the others. Might be worth hearing him out." Rachel frowned slightly, considering the suggestion. "He's already confessed. What else does he need to say?" Logan shrugged. "I think he feels guilty. Maybe he's looking for some kind of redemption." Rachel exhaled slowly, her thoughts racing. She had seen guilt before, but guilt didn't erase actions. Still, the thought of hearing him out lingered in her mind. "I'll think about it," she said finally. As she handed the file back to Logan, her resolve strengthened. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was becoming clearer. Marcus might have planned this, but his arrogance had been his downfall. And as for Jake, Rachel would decide soon whether his regret was genuine or just another attempt to escape responsibility. Rachel sat in the precinct's break room, staring into her untouched cup of coffee. The hum of activity around her barely registered, as her mind replayed Logan's words. "Jake asked to speak with you. He's different from the others." It wasn't unusual for suspects to show remorse after getting caught, but there was something about Jake's reaction the night before, his trembling voice, his pale face, that had stuck with her. It wasn't fear alone. It was something deeper, something that hinted at a young man who hadn't entirely committed himself to the life he was now entangled in. She sighed, stood, and walked to the holding cells where Jake sat alone in a small, dimly lit room. Through the glass, she could see him hunched over, his hands clasped tightly together, his posture screaming defeat. When Rachel opened the door, he flinched slightly but didn't look up. "Jake," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, placing her elbows on the table. "I hear you've got something to say." Jake finally raised his head, and the regret in his eyes was unmistakable. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Rachel's gaze didn't waver. "But you went along with it. You walked through my door, knowing it wasn't yours to enter." He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching nervously on the table. "Marcus said it'd be easy. He made it sound like no one would care. That it was just stuff, you know. I didn't know who lived there, I swear. I didn't know it was you." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "And if it wasn't me? What if it was someone who couldn't fight back? Would you have stopped then?" Jake looked down, shame washing over his face. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I don't know what I would have done. I've never done anything like this before." Rachel studied him for a moment, the silence between them heavy. She had seen hardened criminals in her time, people who lied, manipulated, and schemed without a second thought. Jake didn't fit that mold. He was young, scared, and clearly out of his depth. But remorse didn't erase his actions, and Rachel wasn't one to let sympathy cloud her judgment. "Why did you go along with Marcus?" she asked, her voice steady. "What made you think this was a good idea?" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if searching for an escape. Finally, he exhaled shakily and answered. "I didn't think. That's the truth. Marcus, he talks a big game. He made it seem like it wasn't a big deal, like we'd just go in and get out and no one would ever know. I didn't realize how far he was willing to go. When I saw your dog." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "I knew I was in over my head." Rachel's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "And yet you stayed, even when it was clear things were escalating." "I didn't know what to do," Jake said, his voice rising with desperation. "I was scared, Marcus. He doesn't take no for an answer. He's been dragging me into this stuff for months. I thought this was the only way to prove I wasn't useless." Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Prove to who? Marcus, yourself?" Jake didn't respond immediately, his shoulders slumping further. "Both, I guess," he muttered. "But I screwed up. I know that now." The door opened behind Rachel, and Logan stepped in, his arms crossed. He stood silently, watching the interaction. Rachel glanced at him briefly before turning back to Jake. "You've confessed. The evidence is stacked against you. If you really want to make things right, you're going to have to take responsibility." Jake nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes." Rachel leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his. "Words don't mean much without action, Jake. If you want to prove you're better than this, start by being honest. About everything. No excuses, no lies. You owe that much to yourself." Jake sniffled and wiped his eyes, nodding again. "I will. I promise." Rachel stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She looked at Logan, who gave her a questioning glance. "He's yours," she said, walking past him toward the door. "Let's see if he can back up those words." As Rachel left the holding area, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was sincere. But sincerity wouldn't erase the choices he'd made. The justice system would take its course, and Jake would have to face the consequences, just like Marcus and Eli. Still, as she walked back to her office, she felt a faint flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jake would find a way to change before it was too late. Rachel returned to her office, the weight of the morning's conversations pressing down on her. She sank into her chair, staring at the stack of paperwork waiting on her desk. Normally, the routine of filing reports, reviewing evidence, and coordinating with prosecutors was a grounding process. Today, it felt heavier than usual. Her mind wandered back to Jake's trembling voice. His regret had seemed genuine, but Rachel knew all too well how easily remorse could turn into manipulation. Over the years, she'd learned to spot the difference between true repentance and an act to gain leniency. Jake was young, scared, and in over his head, but he had still crossed a line, just like the others. Her role wasn't to absolve him. It was to ensure justice was served. Max padded into the office, his nails clicking softly against the tile floor. He nudged her knee with his nose, his tail wagging slightly as if sensing her unease. Rachel smiled faintly and reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You always know, don't you?" she murmured. "Always right on time." Max responded with a soft huff, leaning into her touch. For a moment the weight in her chest eased. She straightened in her chair and turned her attention to the task at hand. The report had to be completed, and every detail had to be precise. If Marcus had truly targeted her, it wasn't just a matter of theft, it was a direct challenge, and she intended to ensure he faced the consequences fully. As she typed, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the prosecutor assigned to the case, Melanie Carter. Rachel picked up, her tone professional. "Carter." "Rachel," Melanie greeted, her voice brisk but cordial. "I've been reviewing the case files and statements. We've got a solid case, but I wanted to go over a few things with you." Rachel leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. "What do you need?" "For starters," Melanie began, "Jake's statement. He's admitting to everything, which works in our favor. But he's also painting a picture of Marcus as a manipulative ringleader. If we can corroborate that, it'll strengthen the charges against Marcus. Jake's cooperation might also warrant a lesser sentence, assuming his remorse is genuine." Rachel exhaled slowly. "It seems genuine, but remorse doesn't undo what he did. He still crossed the line, Melanie." "I agree," Melanie said, her tone firm. "But the system works better when we can distinguish between those who can be rehabilitated and those who are beyond it. Jake might be salvageable, and his testimony could be critical." Rachel considered this for a moment, then asked, "What about Eli? Has he been as forthcoming?" Melanie sighed. "Not as much. He's distancing himself from Marcus, claiming he was pressured into it. But he's not taking full responsibility. Typical deflection. He'll likely get a moderate sentence, but he's not doing himself any favors." "And Marcus?" Rachel's voice hardened as she said his name. "Uncooperative as expected," Melanie replied. "He's denying everything, blaming the others and trying to twist the narrative. He's even suggesting you provoked them, which is laughable considering the evidence." Rachel scoffed. "Let him try. Between the footage, the statements, and the fact that they were caught red-handed, he doesn't stand a chance." "Agreed," Melanie said. "We'll push for the maximum sentence for him. His criminal history and leadership in this act give us plenty of leverage." Rachel nodded to herself. "Good. He needs to be held accountable for all of it." There was a brief pause before Melanie added, "One more thing, Rachel. This case is going to attract attention. A police chief targeted in a break-in? The media is going to be all over it." Rachel sighed, her fingers drumming against the desk. "Let them talk. I'm not interested in sensationalizing this. I just want justice done." "Understood," Melanie said. "But if reporters come knocking, you might want to have a statement ready. It's better to control the narrative than let them spin it." Rachel thanked Melanie and ended the call, setting the phone down with a faint thud. She stared at the paperwork in front of her, the words blurring slightly as her mind wandered. The justice system was methodical, deliberate, and sometimes painfully slow, but Rachel believed in its ability to deliver. Still, cases like this reminded her of the gaps, the places where people like Jake fell through, dragged down by influence, desperation, or a lack of direction. She looked down at Max, who had settled at her feet, his steady presence grounding her. "Marcus underestimated me," she said softly, almost to herself. But what he really underestimated was what justice looks like. Max wagged his tail slightly, as though agreeing, and Rachel couldn't help but smile faintly. The fight wasn't over yet, but the pieces were coming together. Marcus would face the consequences of his arrogance, Eli would have to reckon with his choices, and Jake, time would tell if he could rise above his mistakes or remain trapped by them. The precinct buzzed with activity as the afternoon wore on, and Rachel returned to her work, each keystroke a step closer to ensuring the night's events led to a just outcome. For now, that was enough. The day passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and coordination, but Rachel's thoughts remained fixed on the events of the previous night. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, she found herself back at home, Max trotting faithfully beside her as she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, as it always was after a long day, but it no longer felt unsettling. If anything, it felt stronger, more secure. This was her space, her ground, and she had fought to defend it. Rachel set her keys on the kitchen counter and glanced at Max, who had already taken up his usual spot by the window, his watchful eyes scanning the street outside. "Good boy," she said softly, giving him a reassuring pat as she walked past. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the coolness of the drink steady her thoughts. The memory of Marcus's sneer, Jake's trembling hands, and Eli's panicked pleas replayed in her mind. Each one represented a different aspect of the crime. The arrogance, the fear, the regret. Together, they painted a picture of how easily a single bad choice could spiral into chaos. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Logan again, his tone clipped but urgent. "Chief, we've got something you need to hear." Rachel frowned and straightened. "What is it?" "Jake's opened up even more," Logan said. "Turns out Marcus had more going on than just this break-in. Jake claims Marcus was scouting other targets, trying to build what he called a network. He'd recruit people like Jake, young, inexperienced, desperate, and use them to do his dirty work." Rachel's jaw tightened. "He's running an operation." "Looks that way," Logan confirmed. "Jake says this wasn't the first house they broke into, but it was supposed to be the biggest score yet. Marcus knew who you were, Rachel. He thought hitting a police chief's house would make a statement, scare people, prove he was untouchable." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "And Jake? What's he saying about his role in all of this?" "Claims he didn't know about the bigger picture until recently," Logan replied. "He says he got dragged into this mess because of Marcus's manipulation. I'm inclined to believe him, but that doesn't absolve him of what he's done." Rachel nodded, though Logan couldn't see it. "We need to dig deeper. If Marcus has been orchestrating this kind of operation, there's no telling how many others might be involved, or how many people he's already targeted." Logan's voice softened slightly. "We're already on it, Chief. I just thought you'd want to know where things stand." "Thanks, Logan," Rachel said, her tone firm. "Keep me updated." She ended the call and stared out the window, her mind racing. Marcus hadn't just underestimated her. He had underestimated the reach of justice. He had operated under the assumption that people like her, people who work to protect and serve, wouldn't fight back hard enough to dismantle his operation. But he was wrong. Rachel's resolve hardened. She had dealt with criminals like Marcus before, people who thrived on exploiting others, who masked their cowardice with aggression and manipulation. He had made this personal by targeting her home, her sanctuary, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. Max let out a low bark, pulling her from her thoughts. Rachel turned to see him standing by the window, his ears perked and his tail stiff. She crossed the room quickly and peered outside. A car idled at the end of the block, its engine running but its headlights off. Rachel's heart quickened, but her mind remained calm and analytical. She studied the vehicle, noting the dark windows and the faint glow of a phone screen from inside. It wasn't a neighbor's car, and its presence set off every instinct she had developed over decades of law enforcement. She pulled out her phone and dialed the non-emergency line to the precinct. Daniels answered on the second ring. "Daniels." "It's Rachel," she said, her voice steady. "There's a suspicious vehicle parked at the end of my block. Dark sedan, windows tinted, lights off. Can you send a unit to check it out?" "On it," Daniels replied immediately. "Stay inside and keep the doors locked. We'll be there in 5. Rachel hung up and locked the front door, her eyes never leaving the car. Max stood by her side, his body tense but silent. She rested a hand on his back, finding comfort in his presence. Whatever this was, whether it was connected to Marcus or just a random coincidence, she was ready. Minutes later, the familiar flash of blue and red lights lit up the street, and a patrol car pulled up behind the suspicious vehicle. 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holstered weapons as they approached. The driver of the car hesitated before rolling down the window, his movements slow and deliberate. Rachel watched from the window as the officers spoke to the driver. After a few tense moments, one of the officers signaled to the other, and the car was instructed to leave. It pulled away slowly, disappearing into the night. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was Daniel's. "All clear, Chief. Just a delivery driver who got turned around. Nothing to worry about." Rachel let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thanks, Daniels." "Anytime," he replied. "But keep an eye out. After what happened, it doesn't hurt to stay cautious." As the call ended, Rachel turned to Max, who wagged his tail faintly but remained alert. "Good instincts, boy," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "We're not letting our guard down." She stayed by the window for a while longer, watching the street until it was completely quiet. The car might have been harmless, but it was a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Marcus might be in custody, but the ripples of his actions hadn't yet settled. As the night deepened, Rachel finally stepped away from the window, her resolve stronger than ever. She wouldn't let fear invade her home, and she wouldn't rest until Marcus and anyone tied to him faced the full weight of justice. Max followed her to the kitchen, his loyal presence a constant reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Together, they would see this through, no matter what came next. The next morning came with an air of determination. Rachel woke early, her routine precise as always. She prepared Max's breakfast, the clink of the bowl against the countertop a familiar comfort in an otherwise tense atmosphere. The events of the past few days lingered in her mind, not as a burden but as fuel for the day ahead. After checking her emails and reviewing the overnight updates from the precinct, Rachel grabbed her keys and headed out, Max watching her from the front window as she locked the door behind her. The precinct was already buzzing when she arrived, officers moving with purpose as they handled the morning rush of reports and cases. Rachel nodded to a few colleagues on her way to her office but didn't stop. She had too much to do. Logan was waiting for her when she walked in, his usual stack of files in hand. "Morning, Chief," he greeted, placing the files on her desk. "Got some updates on Marcus." Rachel raised an eyebrow as she shrugged off her coat. "Let's hear it." Logan sat down, flipping open one of the folders. "We've been digging into his background and cross-referencing with some other cases. Turns out he's been running this little operation for longer than we thought. Small jobs at first, houses he knew would be easy hits. But over the last year he started getting bolder, targeting wealthier neighborhoods. He built a network, all right, but it wasn't just about theft. He's been using these break-ins to send a message." Rachel leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "What kind of message?" Logan tapped the folder in front of him. "He wants to intimidate people, make them feel vulnerable. The people he targets, retired professionals, small business owners, folks he sees as authority figures, they're all deliberate. He's trying to create this image of control, like he's untouchable. Breaking into your house wasn't just about the score. It was about showing that even a police chief isn't safe." Rachel's jaw tightened, her mind racing as she processed the information. "He's trying to make a name for himself, build a reputation." "Exactly," Logan confirmed. "But here's the thing. His arrogance might be his undoing. The people he's targeted, they're all willing to cooperate with us now that he's been caught. They're tired of being afraid, and they're ready to help take him down." Rachel nodded, her resolve hardening. "Good. Let's make sure every single one of them is heard. I want this case to be airtight. If Marcus thinks he can manipulate people into silence, we're going to prove him wrong." Logan smirked faintly. "Already on it, we're lining up statements and cross-referencing everything with Jake's testimony. Speaking of Jake, his cooperation has been interesting." Rachel leaned back slightly, folding her arms. Interesting how? He's been giving us more names, Logan said, flipping to another page in the folder. People Marcus has worked with, places they've hit, even a few potential future targets. If he's telling the truth, we've got a shot at dismantling this whole operation. Rachel narrowed her eyes. And if he's lying? Logan shrugged. Then it's our job to figure that out. But so far, what he's told us checks out. He might actually be trying to make amends. Rachel tapped her fingers on the desk, her thoughts drifting to her conversation with Jake the day before. She had seen the regret in his eyes, but regret alone wasn't enough. Keep pressing him. If he's holding anything back, I want to know. Logan nodded and stood, gathering the files. Will do. Oh, and one more thing. We've got the arraignment scheduled for Marcus and the others tomorrow. Thought you'd want to be there. Rachel's expression darkened slightly. I wouldn't miss it. After Logan left, Rachel spent the rest of the morning reviewing every piece of evidence, ensuring there were no gaps in the case. She read through Jake's statements again, comparing them with the timelines provided by the other victims. Each detail painted a clearer picture of Marcus's arrogance and the network he had built to sustain it. The more she read, the clearer it became that Marcus's so-called empire was crumbling under the weight of his own hubris. By the time lunch rolled around, Rachel decided to step out for a moment of fresh air. The precinct's parking lot was quiet, the cool breeze a welcome reprieve from the intensity inside. She leaned against her car, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She thought about the people Marcus had targeted, how each one had likely felt powerless in the face of his calculated intimidation. But they weren't powerless now. Together, they would ensure he faced the full weight of justice. As Rachel returned to her office, her phone buzzed with a message from Melanie Carter, the prosecutor. It was short but to the point. We're ready for tomorrow. Bring your game face. Rachel smirked faintly, her determination renewed. The arraignment would be the first step in holding Marcus accountable, and she intended to see it through. For now, though, she returned to her desk, Max's picture sitting on the corner as a silent reminder of why she fought so hard. This wasn't just about her. It was about protecting the people who depended on her, the community that deserved better, and the justice that Marcus had tried so desperately to undermine. As the day wound down, Rachel knew there was still much to do, but she felt prepared. Tomorrow, she would face Marcus in court, and she wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. She was ready to finish what had started on that quiet suburban street, and she wouldn't stop until every piece of his operation was dismantled. The courthouse was alive with tension the next morning as Rachel arrived, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders but failing to unsettle her resolve. She had faced worse than this in her years as a police chief, but today wasn't about the dangers she had faced. It was about ensuring that those who had caused harm faced justice. She parked her car in the lot, adjusting her jacket as she stepped out, the cool morning air carrying with it the murmurs of gathered reporters and curious onlookers. Chief Harper, a journalist called out as she approached the courthouse steps. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust forward. What do you have to say about being targeted by this group? Do you feel safe? Rachel paused, her expression calm but firm. This isn't about me, she said clearly, her voice cutting through the chatter. This is about holding people accountable for their actions and ensuring our community remains safe. Justice will be served, and that's all I have to say. She didn't wait for follow-up questions, moving past the reporters with steady strides. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Officers, attorneys, and witnesses filled the halls, their voices low and purposeful. Rachel spotted Logan near the courtroom entrance, holding a file and chatting with Melanie Carter, the prosecutor. She joined them, her presence commanding attention. Chief, Melanie greeted with a nod. We're ready. The evidence is solid, and the judge isn't likely to be lenient with Marcus, especially given the additional charges tied to his network. Rachel crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. He needs to face everything he's done, not just to me, but to everyone he's hurt. Melanie glanced at the file in Logan's hands. We've got statements from Jake, Eli, and 2 of Marcus's other known associates. Jake's cooperation has been critical, but we're keeping a close eye on his motives. If he's sincere, we might be able to argue for some leniency for him." Rachel nodded, though her focus was already shifting to the courtroom doors. "Let's make sure none of them slip through the cracks." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. Marcus sat at the defense table, his face hardened, his eyes flicking briefly to Rachel before looking away. Next to him sat Eli and Jake, both of whom looked far less composed. Eli's eyes darted nervously around the room while Jake kept his head down, avoiding contact with anyone. Rachel took her seat near the front, her posture straight and her gaze steady. She felt the presence of the other victims behind her, their quiet murmurs fading as the judge entered the room. The bailiff called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Melanie stood to deliver her opening argument, her voice clear and unwavering. She outlined the charges against Marcus, Eli, and Jake: breaking and entering, theft, conspiracy, and in Marcus's case, the additional charges tied to his organized network of crimes. She painted a vivid picture of the fear and harm they had caused, not just to Rachel, but to others in the community who had been too afraid to come forward until now. When the defense attorney spoke, his arguments were predictably weak. He attempted to frame Marcus as a misunderstood individual, blaming the others for exaggerating his role in the crimes. For Jake, the attorney argued for leniency, emphasizing his cooperation and his lack of a prior record. Eli's role was downplayed, with claims that he had been pressured into participating. Rachel's turn to testify came quickly. She walked to the stand with measured steps, her calm presence filling the room. As she adjusted the microphone, she met Marcus's gaze, refusing to flinch. Her testimony was precise, recounting the events of the break-in with unwavering clarity. She described how the intruders had underestimated her, how they had attempted to intimidate her, and how their actions had threatened her sense of safety. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he attempted to suggest that she had overreacted, that her response had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Rachel's sharp gaze silenced him before she even spoke. "Their actions left me no choice," she said firmly. "I defended my home, my property, and my life. If they had walked away when I gave them the chance, none of this would have happened." The courtroom was silent for a moment after she stepped down, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Melanie continued to build the case, calling other witnesses and presenting the security footage that had captured every moment of the break-in. The video played on a large screen, the images stark and undeniable. Marcus's smug confidence, Eli's hesitance, Jake's fear, and Rachel's steadfast defiance. The jury watched intently, their expressions shifting as the evidence unfolded. When Jake took the stand, his demeanor was noticeably different from Marcus and Eli's. His voice trembled slightly as he recounted how Marcus had recruited him, how he had been pressured into participating, and how he had realized too late that he was in over his head. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I made a mistake and I'll live with it for the rest of my life." Melanie pressed him on Marcus's operations, and Jake revealed more about the network Marcus had built, naming others involved, and describing the methods Marcus used to intimidate and control his recruits. His testimony was damning, and by the time he stepped down, the case against Marcus felt insurmountable. The closing arguments solidified the prosecution's position, with Melanie reminding the jury of the harm Marcus had caused and the importance of holding him accountable. The defense's closing arguments were weak, relying on attempts to sow doubt about Jake's credibility and deflect blame onto others. When the jury returned with their verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. The foreperson stood, unfolding a piece of paper with steady hands. "We find the defendant, Marcus Hill, guilty on all charges," she said. The room exhaled collectively as the additional guilty verdicts for Eli and Jake followed. The judge addressed Marcus directly, her tone stern. "Your actions were calculated, malicious, and intended to cause fear. This court sentences you to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 10. Eli Carter, you are sentenced to 8 years. Jake Warren, given your cooperation and lack of prior record, you are sentenced to 5 years, with eligibility for parole after 3. As the sentences were handed down, Rachel felt a wave of relief. Justice had been served, not just for her but for everyone Marcus had tried to exploit. As the defendants were led out in handcuffs, Marcus shot her one last look, his eyes filled with anger. Rachel met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unyielding. Outside the courthouse, the reporters were waiting, their cameras and microphones aimed at Rachel. She paused on the steps, her voice steady as she addressed them. This case was about more than a single crime. It was about standing up to those who think they can take what isn't theirs and intimidate others into silence. Today, justice was served, and our community is safer for it. As Rachel returned home that evening, the weight of the case began to lift. Max greeted her at the door, his wagging tail and bright eyes a welcome sight. She knelt to hug him, murmuring softly, "It's over, boy. We did it." Later, as she sat on the porch with Max by her side, the quiet street felt peaceful again. The fight wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming her sense of safety and proving that no one, not even someone like Marcus, could take that away. Rachel watched the sunset, her resolve stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she would face them with the same courage and determination that had carried her through this one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.